Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. In keeping with my desire to be the fastest introducer in town, I'm just going to tell you we have a wonderful panel. You have a list of their bios, and you can read all about their achievements. And with that, we will go straight into the events.
That was the shortest introduction.
The shortest I've ever done, and mine are known to be short.
Well done. Thank you, John.
We have a very interesting topic today. Kazakhstan, especially after the presidential election there, the transfer of power, which is very, very important. And I'm going to start by asking Ambassador Dick Norland, to comment on the transition from President Nazarbayev to President Tokayev, how it looks to him. He spent 3 years as ambassador and many more years in Central Asia. So Dick, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. Actually, what I'm going to do is give a little bit of background and set the scene for the experts who will know what they're talking about. But this is sort of the way that we plan this whole program. So what I want to start with is U.S. policy in the region, and of course for Kazakhstan, and then look a little bit at why Kazakhstan has succeeded so far, and then touch on the big neighbors, Russia and China. And if I run too long, cut me off.
I will.
All right. Thank you. U.S. policy in Central Asia is really broadly written so that it covers all the 5 countries in the region. And its basis is the National Security Council's National Security Strategy for Central Asia. And in fact, the latest one, which will be the first one from the Trump administration, is expected to be approved and released by the end of the summer. I've seen it. I have consulted on it, and I can assure you there are no shocking deviations from the past, which is another way of saying there's not much new. But that's basically because U.S. foreign policy in the region has been really consistent for the last quarter century, since the fall of the Soviet Union. In broadest terms, U.S. interest and strategic objectives in Central Asia are the following: prevent terrorists from gaining safe haven anywhere in the region, encourage the 5 countries to contribute to stability in Afghanistan and, of course, in the region, preserve and protect the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of each of the Central Asian states, safeguard U.S. economic interests and continue to promote economic reform, and respect good governance and civil liberties. Now, that's very broad, and these are non-controversial and laudable. Implementing them, however, takes a little bit of finesse, because since independence, each of the 5 nations of Central Asia has really gone its own way. At the very beginning, people spoke of them as the stans, as if it was all one country. But each country is now really quite different from what it was at the very beginning. Today we're looking specifically at Kazakhstan, that from the fall of the Soviet Union has really been the key country of Central Asia. Apart from just a little bit of northwestern Kazakhstan, it's on the Asian landmass, but you cross the Ural River and you're in Europe, and so Kazakhstan has always defined itself as Eurasian, and it insists on that. It's not Asian, it is Eurasian. Kazakhstan made a lot of good decisions at the beginning. Economic reform, non-proliferation, giving up one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. In fact, in 2010, I participated in the ceremony where we locked down enough highly enriched uranium and plutonium from the BN-350 nuclear reactor that could have made 750 nuclear weapons. Wow. And then the other very important thing that Kazakhstan did from the very beginning, even when they didn't have the money to do so, they set up the Bolshak program, which sends young Kazakhstanis abroad for college education. Not an exchange semester, full college education, and sometimes even graduate school. So what that does is create globalized citizens. And you walk into government offices and businesses in Kazakhstan, and you feel that. You hear it. the languages spoken, the way that the world is seen. It's really quite amazing. Let's look very briefly at the big neighbors, because one thing that Kazakhstan also did from the very beginning was set up something called multi-vector foreign policy, balancing to the fullest extent possible China, Russia, the United States further away, and Europe. Russia, simply for geographic and political reasons, is an essential partner of Kazakhstan. President Putin has long declared Central Asia to be Russia's special sphere of influence, and sometimes he says Russia's exclusive sphere of influence, probably deciding on how he feels that day. But during his tenure, President Nazarbayev very carefully balanced his relationships so that he maintained a fully cordial relationship with Russia and became a founding member of Russia's Eurasian Economic Union. But that doesn't mean that Kazakhstan is a vassal of Russia. Excellent relations and fully independent. China's presence in Central Asia has changed over the years. At first, it was there simply for economic reasons. But as they have now instituted the Belt and Road Initiative, and I'll say a bit about that, the soft power that they've been doing, economic exchanges, everything like that, inevitably throughout the region will become hard power. And it's already seen in a few open reports from Central Asia, Chinese military presence now, specifically in Tajikistan, but it's going to come elsewhere too. We in the West sort of didn't pay attention to China for at least a decade in Central Asia. But then when President Xi Jinping announced at Nazarbayev University in Astana, or then Astana, now Nursultan, in September 13, its new Silk Road economic belt running from east to west across Central Asia, we perked up our ears. We said, I wonder if there's any way we could possibly work with China on this. Or at least some of us did. I said that. And I was in a position where I could do something about it with a little bit of nagging and coattail tugging. And so in 2014, in the fall, I went to Beijing to consult with the Chinese leaders about what they were doing with their, what had come to be called the One Belt, One Road Initiative. And I was very well received. And we had a lot in common, and so we agreed to meet quite soon later. Except the U.S. had never really bought into this initiative. I think they were just sort of patting me on the head and being nice to me and getting me out of their hair for a while. And then there was a purge in Beijing, and the leaders I had talked to were imprisoned. And so it took another 6 months until there were new people in place. The second time I went, I had an official page and a half of areas where we could specifically cooperate in Central Asia. And they said, fantastic, that is very interesting, we'll get back to you. And then they never did, yes. And then we never did either because we weren't fully committed to this. In any case, China with now Belt Road Initiative, BRI, is playing a significant role throughout the region. I think the one thing I'm going to finish on here, because I don't want to take too much time, is I'm going to praise and encourage one more development in Central Asia that Kazakhstan has taken the lead on. The new generally reformist government in Uzbekistan has worked very well with Kazakhstan to begin to explore and to encourage establishing a regional organization in Central Asia. Maybe on the model of ASEAN in East Asia, maybe on the model of the Baltic Council, but nevertheless, they're seriously looking at this. And I believe by U.S. policy, this should be highly encouraged because it would make for a stronger Central Asia region on the world stage and would benefit all the peoples of the region. So with that, I'll call it quits and we can take questions later if you like.
Dan?
Well, Dick, I agree with virtually everything, and most importantly, that there have been, by many objective measures, remarkable results in Kazakhstan over the last 28 years. And at the center of that has been Kazakhstan's embracing, welcoming of open economic policies and foreign direct investment. And that has transformed the Kazakh economy, but perhaps more importantly, has delivered prosperity for the people. Think about per capita GDP, under 400, now touching 24,000 per capita GDP over 28 years. I think the challenge today at this inflection point, at this transition point, however you wish to describe the moving from one leader to another, is how do you sustain this growth and continuing increasing of prosperity for your people? And that's the challenge, because you must continuously improve your investment conditions, your economic investment climate. Now, we're tax guys largely. I believe you must continue to improve the competitiveness of your tax regime and its transparency. And I'm a firm believer, tax and customs is how do you share the money between the state and the government. So in emerging markets, in developing markets, I believe tax is a country's most important trade policy. So let's just take a moment to look back. Not too far, because I think this panel is really to look forward. But to look at the remarkable economic and social, and I know the social issues and the protests have been in the newspaper, but let's look at this social and economic journey over the last 28 years. So upon the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia, Kazakhstan, the other CIS countries all faced similar challenges. But today, 28 years later, each of these countries find themselves in different positions. Some still struggling, some a little bit prosperous, some more prosperous. And it's because the leaders made difficult decisions on the time, decisions when they were weak, decisions made with a very empty stomach, if you will. And then it was, how did they continue to pursue these policies? In Kazakhstan, while it suffered from many external shocks, whether it be oil price because of their neighbors, they've had a consistent upward trajectory and a predictable and stable set of economic policies. And this is something that ITIC has studied. I think we've done 22 economic climate surveys beginning in 1998. And as part of one of these studies, we used that book that many of you have read, the literature by Jim Collins at Stanford, in his 2011 book, Good to Great. And it tries to look at, in contrast, companies that were enormously successful, some who have then failed a couple years later, and those that have went on to new levels of greatness. So we use this framework, this comparative analysis, to look at the countries in Central Asia, the countries in Eurasia, including Russia, of course. And the key is, and again, you see countries jumping around to this. They think there's a silver bullet, there's a new fad, but that wasn't the case in Kazakhstan. They had a tangible point of focus, and it slightly changed, but from as long as I can remember, and I first went to Kazakhstan in 1993, President Nazarbayev wanted Kazakhstan to be among the most competitive countries in the world, as measured by the World Economic Forum, as measured by the World Bank. Independent measures. They were constantly striving for that. So you had a 2020 plan, you've got a 2030 plan, a 2050 plan, but that tangible target never, ever changed. And I think that has distinguished Kazakhstan from its peers, and the results that have delivered prosperity for the people have followed. Now, that goal, that tangible target, has been reaffirmed by President Tokayev. So I think we're going to see a smooth transition. We're not going to see any deviation from the key elements of Kazakhstan's investment climate pillars. But with these types of things, you can't declare the job done. I think Kazakhstan suffered a few years back, putting aside the global economic crisis, putting aside the 2014 crash of oil prices, kind of a reform fatigue. You had a lot of these people that had been at it for decades or more thinking, we've done economic reform, we're done. No, it's an ongoing process. And you think about what Kazakhstan did. Immediately upon independence, it was a backwater oil country. How they transformed themselves to be one of the most powerful oil-producing countries in the world. They took bold steps. It's easy to forget about 1994-95, but that was a bold step when President Nazarbayev and Ken Dur, the CEO of Chevron, held hands and jumped in the water together. I mean, Nazarbayev was betting the future of Kazakhstan on the success of that project, and make no mistake, Ken Dur was betting the future of Chevron. Had it gone south, I think it would be Texaco taking over Chevron. And we know the story today. It was a success. Bold steps. Now, as we look at the future, making a world-class financial center in Astana, the next round of privatization, I think the choke point right now is the state owns too many assets. The state has too big a role in business. So to privatize that will require further bold steps of throwing out laws. Things like we've seen with the creation of Nazarbayev University. It wasn't put this way, but that was a disruptor, ladies and gentlemen. That was an admission that our current system of higher education is a failure. We're going to create a Western model. We're going to have a Western governance structure. We're going to have academic freedom. We're going to hold our professors and our students accountable. The parents can't bribe for grades. And that is Nazarbayev University. Contrast it with the others. The Astana Financial Center, an admission that the current banking system is a failure. And we need to think outside the box. If we want to become like Singapore, we need the legal, regulatory, and human infrastructure to do so. So those are the bold steps, not tinkering around the edges. And we can think of many examples with tinkering. So as a tax guy, a couple of steps. And President Nazarbayev has touched on these, but more importantly, in the post-election speech in June, President Tokayev highlighted these. A competitive tax regime, cognizant of the overall tax burden on the people, and also the aggressive auditing and tax enforcement. Things like the criminalization of tax disputes. Those have been identified as things that need to be cleaned up, certainly things that need to be cleaned up if they ever have a hope of joining the OECD. Now, even though I've been accused at times of being a tax nerd, there's a limit to what tax can do. So you think about the pillars of a competitive economy: contract sanctity, property rights, free labor markets, including labor mobility, which is a critical element for the young people in Kazakhstan, for the young people who may be protesting, and then, of course, corruption. Those four elements have been reaffirmed as targets for continuing reform by President Tokayev. And I'll close with just one of my favorite history lessons of all time, and I think even right here in our country, we need this lesson, that history has repeatedly proven that competitive tax burdens, simple and clear regulatory regime, and strong protection of property rights will attract new investors. This has been the path of Kazakhstan since 1991, and happily, this path has been reaffirmed by President Tokayev. Thank you.
Okay. Sarah, you've been very much involved in business, U.S. Kazakh business. How does the business environment look there?
Sure. Yes, the U.S.-Kazakhstan Business Association, our role is to help and support, represent American companies who do business in Kazakhstan. So you can imagine that this is something we've been watching very closely. The themes that Ambassador Hoagland and that Dan mentioned, the economic reform, the property rights, the education, workforce development, are all very much a part of creating this positive investment climate. But so far, I think the theme in the transition from President Nazarbayev to President Tokayev, in terms of the relationship with international investors, is stability, in all caps. In outlining his administration's platform in his inaugural address, President Tokayev's first promise was to continue the work of the first President Nazarbayev and implement his long-term strategy. This includes the initiatives such as the third modernization, the 5 industrial reforms, etc. Last week, in a meeting here in DC, Kazakhstan's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Atamkulov, confirmed this focus on stability. The continuity of policies and the promises begun under President Nazarbayev that attracting foreign investment is a priority. There are long and ongoing discussions about the need to protect current investors and investors' rights as well. There's a focus on maintaining and building on the policies and precedents that Nazarbayev set over the past almost 30 years. There's also a sense of looking forward, as we're saying, not saying there's not, but this focus on the implementation of the projects and the initiatives that were set out is, I think, foremost. The government of Kazakhstan recognizes that the stability and continuity are among the most important issues for investors. And this is one of the biggest things I'm hearing and the questions I'm having from the American business community as they're looking to continue their business there. Kazakhstan presents itself as a platform from which international investors can export their goods to the broader market. As we've heard, China, Central Asia, Europe, the AU, and that can work with U.S.-Russia tensions and the various concerns or barriers related to investment in China, along with the real opportunities in sectors like agribusiness and infrastructure, and of course continued investment in energy. Kazakhstan's multi-vectoral foreign policy is important in maintaining the balance and the relationships necessary to deliver on the promise of a broader export market. The promises of privatization that both the former administration and the current president promised to continue. This is something that current and prospective investors are following very closely. The plans for privatization of state-owned companies, the real transparent and significant privatization will be necessary to attract new investors to come to the market and to encourage further investment from current investors. We haven't seen this large-scale privatization yet. There are discussions of 25% stake in Kazmunay Gas being privatized in 2020, and Air Astana and Kazakh Telecom have also been discussed as candidates in the near term. But the mechanisms for this privatization will be very important. Judicial reform, focus on rule of law and judicial reform continue to be a priority. Initiatives like the mentioned Astana National Financial Center's International Investors Court, which uses British common law, and the Foreign Investors Council, as well as the domestic judicial reforms, demonstrate that the government of Kazakhstan recognizes this and is taking steps in the right direction. I think one of the biggest things, too, is the interest in new projects and the opportunities to invest and just the high levels of activity in the country from EBRD and OPIC and other international financial institutions, World Bank, et cetera. It demonstrates a larger level, like a global belief in the opportunities for international businesses looking to operate and invest there. I think, again, just want to touch on the education and the workforce development and things that all come together to make it a positive place to invest. As was mentioned, the promised continued work on corruption. All of this goes to say, there's still significant room for improvement in areas. The focus on stability and the pledge to uphold the previously made commitments is a good and reassuring sign for investors. Now we're looking for the implementation and the continued work forward with American companies, especially from my perspective, but all international investors to make good on these opportunities.
Okay, Sarah, thank you.
Yeah.
Ariel, you're clearly one of the best minds in town on Eurasia overall. So your sense as to latest developments in Kazakhstan transition, the impact on regional developments in Central Asia.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Herbst, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. I think any political transition is a challenge. You see, as I monitor what's going on in Russia, and they just sort of showed an ankle of possible future transition, and everybody is just jumping up and down.
We remember what happened in Turkmenistan when people were incarcerated. Relatively speaking, the Uzbek transition went smoothly, but here the transition is constitutional. The transition involves continuity, but at the same time, any leader, including President Tokayev, would want to imprint his own mark on the presidency. And I think President Nazarbayev is supportive. I've been in big meetings, not small meetings, but meetings with 100 plus people where Mr. Nazarbayev was extremely supportive, but at the same time unmistakably signaling that the new phase is going on, that he is not the day-to-day manager of affairs. And the challenge of transition on that level, on the level of head of state, is to integrate domestic challenges and regional challenges and global challenges. Let's talk about regional. I think as both Ambassador Herbst and Ambassador Hoagland noticed, the key here is the relationship between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. It really creates an atmosphere that we haven't seen in Central Asia before, although Nazarbayev went out of his way to accommodate the previous president of Uzbekistan, President Karimov. The relationship had its ups and downs. Today things are much better both internally in Uzbekistan and bilaterally between Tashkent and Nursultan, and for the region as a whole. There's a lot of things the region can do in things I'm interested in: energy, the development of hydro, the exchanges of amounts of electricity and water, exports of electricity, environmental renewal, including of the ROC, which was an unmitigated catastrophe of planetary scale. Literally, probably hundreds of thousands of people got sick because of evaporation of water and salt being spread around and getting into one's lungs and causing disease. In terms of economic development, as already was mentioned, the region is uneven. Some countries did not go out of their way like Kazakhstan did in terms of bringing education in general and Western patterns of education to educate both the elites and the general population. The challenge also, as the new generation, let's not forget, President Nazarbayev, with all due respect, was a product of the Soviet system. He rose tremendously from humble beginnings, being the son of peasants, through the metallurgy industry. He worked, I think, in Karaganda, which is now owned by Lakshmi Mittal, to the highest level of Soviet and then post-Soviet offices. When you talk to 30-year-olds today in Kazakhstan, the outlook is very different. They want the educated, Western traveling or Western educated men and women and men, should we say that? They want open, democratic, prosperous, Western-style country with norms of civil rights as we understand them increasingly observed. And the government understands and knows that. Mr. Tokayev did talk about the recent demonstration and protests that happened around the election time. Said, we heard the protests, we're going to address it. They're going to have new policies on fighting corruption. I think corruption is a big issue. They are doing an interesting thing, which Dan and I should probably talk more about it, which is debt forgiveness. As a free market person, I'm against debt forgiveness from the economic point of view. People should recognize the severity of their personal economic decisions. They're forgiving small loans.
About 500,000 people.
Yeah, 500,000 people Small loans under $2,500, $2,400 or less. So you took a little credit to buy a fridge or to buy maybe a car, cheap car or whatever, that will be forgiven. But that raises questions in my mind about how you enforce financial discipline in the country, just like people who offer total debt forgiveness or loan forgiveness to students. I question their good economic senses, especially in a country that as deeply in debt as ours. But that was an aside.
Different panel for that.
Yeah. Another thing I'm personally very interested in for Kazakhstan, for Russia, for Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, etc., is that in 15, 20, 25 years, we may be looking at a serious decline of oil and gas revenues. I spoke in Skolkovo. Everybody knows what Skolkovo is? Very few here. Skolkovo is a flagship Russian business school. I spoke at an energy conference. And at the energy conference, the message from the Europeans, the main market for Russia and Kazakhstan, for their oil, and for Russia oil and gas, for Kazakhstan oil, the main message is, we are going zero emissions in, they said 10 years in terms of buying. Let's say it's 15, let's say it's 20 years. That's less than one generation. What is Kazakhstan going to do? What is Turkmenistan is going to do when this jig is up? A huge challenge, and I think Kazakhstan is better suited to address it because they think long term. They think about 2050. They think about getting to the 30 OSCE top 30 countries. But they need to develop alternative industries, alternative employment, alternative sources of income for that ambitious economic agenda that President Tokayev is articulating, including debt forgiveness. He wants to bump up the healthcare budget to 5% of the GDP. Just to remind, if I remember correctly, our healthcare allocations, granted not the most effective in the world, but it's 15% of the GDP. He wants to bump up education to 5%.
Public and private. Here.
Here.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
they have, probably they're talking 5%
Right.
public.
Yeah.
Regardless, they already are developing away from the Russian and Soviet model. They trained a lot of people in Germany. There is a mix of private and public healthcare in Kazakhstan. Bump up 5 to 5% of the GDP, the educational budgets, open new universities. These are all steps in the right direction, but you all heard about the middle income trap for countries. And that is a huge challenge. Small trading city-states like Singapore, Hong Kong, and others manage to jump that because they're trading, because they're on the ocean, very different situation. Can Kazakhstan, because of its geographic location, at what did they call it, the belt buckle of the Belt and Road, can they develop transportation, trade, etc., to capitalize on their location, to turn the landlocked nature of Kazakhstan into advantage, not to the disadvantage? And combining, looking at it from 60,000 feet, not 30,000 feet, combining the geoeconomic and geopolitical consideration with purely econ, business and econ climate that Dan addressed and others. How do you manage when you're a country of 3 time zones, a big, big country, right? Kazakhstan, I think, is bigger than all of Western Europe, something like that. With very low population density, with a lot of places that really don't have water. I flew, where was I flying from? I think I flew from Moscow to Almaty. So you look down, you go, it's a daytime flight, you go, you look down. no rivers, no lakes, nothing. How do you develop that when you have Russia and China sandwiching it? Where you have masses of dislocated people from Afghanistan, people who are potential economic migrants from further out east, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, etc. What do you do here? And the multi-vector policy was mentioned. I think as long as Mr. Nazarbayev is there and that relationship with Putin is there, that we hope that there will be no massive earthquakes. We see the amount of pressure Russia is applying to Belarus to increase integration. Belarus is in the same Eurasian Economic Union as Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, etc. Is that pressure going to come? I remember talking to President Nazarbayev about the Russian demands of introducing joint currency. At the time, President Nazarbayev was pushing back very hard. Is President Tokayev going to do the same? Probably yes, today. It also depends what kind of pressure Russia may or may not bring. I hope they will not. I hope they recognize that certain progress is achieved with the Eurasian Economic Union, but at the same time, China is pushing on Kazakhstan very, very hard. And I think looking long term, I talk about the 20-year, 25-year time horizon on hydrocarbon revenues. China is and will be increasingly the dominant geo-economic player, not just economic player, not just an investor, geo-economic player through what? Through BRI. Here is the Chinese joint communique of the Belt and Road, Second Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation, April 28th. The intern did not put the source, so I don't know where it's published. Belt and Road News, but I strongly, highly recommend for everybody to read it, and especially as I did, compare it side by side with the joint EU-Kazakhstan communique. So this is...
May suggest doing a tweet with both of those links.
Maybe. This is 12 pages. Every one of them is an action item. It's not just on Kazakhstan. It goes west as far as Serbia and east as far as, I don't know, who's Chinese friend on the east? North Korea. You see how detailed, specific, and policy-oriented. We do youth education programs. We do alternative energy. We do environmental programs. We have, with the Chinese, have 100 billion of Chinese funding in the Asian International Investment Bank, plus other members, another 100 billion supposedly commitments, and with the private sector going up to 2 trillion. What did the EU document does? Platitudes, water, rhetoric, empty rhetoric. I think the writing is, so to speak, on the wall. China is and will be the leading geoeconomic player, and it's a challenge not just for Kazakhstan, for everybody, for Uzbekistan, and already for Russia to recognize what this is. When I go to Moscow, people say, oh, we don't need to worry about China. We have nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons are an answer to other people's nuclear weapons, right? It's a deterrence. It's not your economic tool. It's not stopping investment. It's not stopping the Confucius Institute cultural expansion. It's not stopping anything. This is the environment that, as Ambassador Hoagland said, the U.S. is looking, and there's not a lot of innovation. Ambassador, let me suggest we need to start thinking outside of the box. We need to start thinking about innovation.
Wouldn't that
and
be
what
nice?
I hear in the region is the invitation to the United States, not to challenge China, not to challenge Russia, but be there and do much more than we're currently doing. Are we doing it, Ambassador?
No.
I don't think so. And with that thought, I stop myself because I can go on for another 3 hours. Thank you.
How are you? You lived up to your billing. And you raised a very important subject that I'd like to explore further, meaning the China-Russia equation in Central Asia. But I have a more important function that I need to do right now.
Timekeeping.
Because we have had 40 minutes of discussion of Kazakhstan today, and we haven't addressed, I would say, one of the two most important stories in Kazakhstan. There's a very careful walking around it. The first important story, which obviously you've addressed, is the transition, meaning that Nazarbayev is sort of out and Tokayev is sort of in. And that's important because this was a question we were concerned about for years. But the other question we have not addressed, the one that's gotten a lot of newspaper attention, and you hinted at it in a sense, Ariel, when you said that there are these young, impressive people in Kazakhstan who want an open society, who want the type of values we're seeing in the West. Yet you've had an election which was deeply imperfect, and that's a diplomatic formulation, and which produced substantial demonstrations. And the demonstrators were not treated, let's say, mildly. They weren't sent to concentration camps, but they were arrested. So what is the meaning of those demonstrations for the transition and for the future of Kazakhstan? And I'll have to have anyone on the panel want to address that.
Let me touch on it and actually recognize John Gardner, who was Ariel and I co-led what we found out to be the only independent U.S. observation mission to the Kazakhstan election.
Reflecting the American perception that the elections would not be free and fair, and it's not an unfair perception.
Yeah, I'm not sure why NRI or ITIC didn't go. I think that this is not the first one they haven't been at, but I can't speak to that. And as you can tell from my remarks, this isn't my day job.
Right.
It's the only country that I've ever been an election observer to, and it's because of my personal interest, frankly, my intellectual curiosity to look at how do economic reforms move with political and democratic reforms. And President Nazarbayev, a decade ago had said, we're going to do economic reforms first, and then we're going to do political and democratic reforms. And so our team, we met with every single, there were 7 candidates. We met with every leader or candidate of each party. We asked a couple of standard questions in each. Number one, have you encountered any interference or any government problems, administrative problems, to run your campaign? Everyone said, no, we've been uninhibited to run our campaign. Number two, and this was a very relevant question after the last iteration here in the United States, will you trust the vote count? And no one hesitated to say yes. Of course, absolutely, were the answers. And this was from 4 of the 7 candidates themselves. For the first time ever, where John observed the poll closing and where I observed the poll closing, the lead opposition candidate won. At Nazarbayev University and at the National Museum in the capital.
And in Shymkent.
And in Shymkent.
What Sokor observed.
Yep. And then the next day, by the next morning, all of the opposition, all of the 6 candidates conceded and pledged to work with the government and expressed their hope that this would be the formation of a multi-party opposition. So it's a start, 70% on a 77% turnout was a decisive victory. I think it's progress that it wasn't 92, 98% that we've seen for President Nazarbayev. That 15 or 17% for Kassanov, I think was remarkable progress. And if it can be the source of developing a party versus just an individual, I think it will make for a very interesting parliamentary election in 1 or 2 years' time. So I do think we are seeing seeds planted for a real and meaningful opposition in Kazakhstan. Will it go the way of Russia, where you had egos of opposition leaders killing such prospects? It's unclear.
Or opposition leaders killed.
Yep. So I look at this.
Egos killing. Opposition leaders killed.
Correct.
Murder.
So, I don't think there's any such thing as a perfect election. Our country, UK, even the UK, by OSCE standards, given that we as foreign observers would not be allowed in a polling station in the UK, the OSCE must say a UK election does not meet the standards of the OSCE. So it's safe to, and we don't meet the standards for a presidential election because of the Electoral College. So I like to look at this, and that was another reason, is I believe you have to measure it in terms of progress and guess this instead of some utopian standard. I don't think Kazakhstan is ever going to be Norway or the Netherlands by any measures. But as Fred Starr and I wrote in an op-ed years ago after observing a presidential election, I compared it to raising a democracy is like raising a child. And I say that with my 19-year-old child here, and I said, if you tried to raise a kid the way the OSCE tries to raise a democracy, the kid's going to run away from home at 14. Happily, Teddy's still at home. So it was progress. It was far from perfect. It was progress.
Yeah.
I want to look at this just very slightly differently. I think it's absolutely essential to remember that Kazakhstan is not in the Western tradition. They didn't go through everything hundreds of years ago that made us who we are now in the West. They didn't have the Reformation. They didn't have the Reformation, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. There is no single focus on how they go all the way back to the Byzantine tradition, and then also back to their nomadic and Khanate tradition. So we can't compare, it's comparing apples and oranges. One thing that we have to think about the demonstrations most recently in the run-up to the election and after the election is that we're seeing headline version. We're not seeing day-to-day on the street version. Yes, indeed, there were people who were arrested. The great majority, I'm told, were released quite soon. There were demonstrations, but those reports are quite often coming from RFE-RL, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, which tends toward the opposition point of view. And of course, headlines have to have something that grabs your attention. But from the opposition point of view, here's something else that actually was reported. In the run-up to the election, after Nazarbayev announced that he was going to be partially stepping aside, some of this was really stirred up, as it has been in the past, by exiled Kazakh banker, convicted criminal, Mukhtar Abdulazov.
Convicted in UK, not in Kazakhstan.
Yes.
Also in Kazakhstan, maybe, but
Yeah.
in UK.
And he has been trying to stir the political pot for well over 10 years and tried it again. So that's where some of it came from, too. Some is absolutely legitimate. That's right. But there is a little bit of skewing on how this is reported in the West, and I think we need to keep that in mind.
Ariel?
When we did the election observation, probably against
Yes.
my better judgment of personal safety, I ventured into the thick of these demonstrations. I went to look. Right? I'm a curious person. I also did.
You are a curious person.
What's that?
He agrees.
The inflection matters.
I also did
Definition
audience
number
research. I did audience research. So things like estimating the size of the crowd, the demographics of the crowd. That's all very interesting for me. So what did I see? I saw a crowd of maybe 500 or 600 people. And granted, I came 2 or 3 hours after the demonstration news broke through. Altogether in Almaty and Astana, the two biggest cities, the media reports, not the government reports, the media reports were 4,000 demonstrators. You said it's significant in a country of 17 million relative to the population, with no demonstrations in Shymkent and no demonstrations elsewhere. Point number one. 4,000 is 4,000. Number two, I observed the level of violence. The level of violence was when the police gave the warning for people to disperse. People did not disperse. They gave the warning again. People didn't disperse. The police, oftentimes without, some police with special gear, some police without any gear, without weapons, without tear gas, without the batons, took some of these guys and pushed them on buses, and the guys offered passive resistance. So they did not go, but they did not fight back with fistifights. I also observed some people in traditional Islamic garb, short pants, narrow pants, called shalvar kameez, usually a sign of Sunni, more traditional Islamists.
Wahhabism.
Beards, Wahhabis, thank you. Beards, etc., looking very nervous, looking like they were, courting trouble in my interpretation. And some people who looked very poor, and they screamed the only slogan I heard there, which is boycott, which is boycott the elections. Ambassador Hoagland mentioned the foreign involvement in some of these with some of the protesters. I do not rule it out at all.
Oh, yeah.
And credit should go to President Tokayev for saying, we heard it, we recognize it, there are grievances, we're going to address it. Is this perfect record of human rights? No, it's not. Is it something catastrophic? Not from what I saw. Maybe in some other places there were things that I did not see. But what I saw in Astana, going there out of my own initiative, not coordinating with anybody, just telling the driver, where is it? It's in this particular area. Just drive there, getting out of the car, walking around, running into some people that I knew. But anyway, could happen in Chicago. Actually,
It does.
Actually, I saw news reports of 50 people being killed in Chicago per weekend. Not by police, local violence. I did not see anything like that in Kazakhstan.
Just one short addition to everything. I do think just even the fact that there were these protests signals some of the movement forward that we've been talking about, that people are feeling like they can go out and make their opinions known in a different way. We also have to, talking about RFE, and the different news sources, the addition of Facebook and Twitter, it amplifies a lot of the things that we were seeing, and it also allows for that cross-communication that we haven't had in previous Kazakhstan's never had this situation before to start with. So I just think that's an important point to add on.
Okay. I'm mindful of the time, but I still want to go back to what Ariel had said before we began this discussion. The China-Russia relationship. We've seen the emergence of a kind of entente between Beijing and Moscow. But it seems to me the place where that entente faces perhaps the largest friction is in Central Asia. So Ariel, if you could comment on that.
So far, we saw a very good working relationship between Moscow and Beijing. When there was a contemplation of introducing some Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which we didn't talk about very much. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of course, is not based in Shanghai. It's not cooperation, and it's not it's not organized.
Oh, that's not quite true.
A whole nother panel, another panel.
Yeah.
So that's a joke coming from the officials of the Shanghai Cooperation. It's in Beijing. It's not cooperation. It's Chinese diktat, and it's not organized. Okay. So at that time, the Russians said there are disturbances and clashes, a lot of people killed in Osh, Kyrgyzstan, let's send the special forces of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are called the RATS, into Osh, and the Chinese and the Uzbeks said no. President Karimov said no, and the Chinese said no, and as a result, the RATS did not go to Osh. So far, there's a lot of rhetoric. I have their materials here. There's a lot of rhetoric about cooperation. I think it's getting so big and unwieldy, with India joining as an observer, with Iran, I think, joining, Pakistan.
Not yet.
Not
India and
Observers.
India and
Observers.
Pakistan, but
Yeah.
Iran is pending.
Well, first of all, imagine the level of cooperation between India and
Yes,
Pakistan,
indeed.
for starters.
Yeah.
But anyway, it is created as one, a counterbalance to the United States. Two, the old vision of Yevgeny Maximovich Primakov, Prime Minister Primakov, that yours truly and others were laughing at in the 90s when he said Moscow, Beijing, and New Delhi are going to have consultations and decide policies. It's happening. It's very interesting. And yes, granted, Mr. Xi and Mr. Modi will not see eye to eye. But the level of the center of gravity shifting east, as they say, China leading with the BRI, that is something I think did not sink in Washington enough.
Oh, that's true.
It's still a very geeky discussion here. So I think they'll manage for a while. I think something like unilateral Russian military or paramilitary action like we saw in Ukraine vis-a-vis Kazakhstan if there's a crisis and the Russians want to take the northern quarter that is populated by Russian speakers and or add to that the western quarter where oil is. I think China will say no, and that veto power is going to be executed.
So go ahead,
Yeah, I
Sarah.
think China will say no. I think China will they'll protect their investments in Kazakhstan, full stop. And just to kind of go on that, Kazakhstan
Please.
in the middle of Russia and China, I think it's part of the reason that they are continuing to push this multi-vectoral balance, bringing in the U.S., trying to bring in and protect U.S. investment there. But China's interest in Kazakhstan in some ways makes it a little bit more difficult for American investors, American companies looking in. Chinese companies don't demand the same kind of
That's right.
contract transparency or procurement practices or even human rights issues that American companies expect.
Especially.
Especially.
And the application of the Chinese version of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is probably much
Very
more
different.
lax.
Yes. Very different.
Non-existent.
Much more liquid.
Yeah. In many ways.
Right. Okay. I'd like to open this up for questions, but I just want to make one observation on this topic before we do that. I think that there are some smart people in Moscow, not enough of them, who recognize that within 8 or 10 years, the Chinese will have completely eaten their lunch in Central Asia. And Primakov did not see that. He saw an interim development, but not the true danger that China represents to Russia's sense of a special area of influence in Central Asia. And with that, questions. Okay, right here first.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an Intel analyst and a former diplomat. There's about 10 to 12% of the Chinese Job Corps camps are in fact Kazakhs. And people are realizing that these are not anti-Kazakh camps or anti-Uyghur camps. This is anti-Islam camps. And in consequence of that, we have some intelligence that people in rural, particularly religious people, Kazakhstan, are increasingly pissed off that their government is doing nothing to free their cousins. And in many cases, they really are their cousins because they came over in the early 90s out of China. I think this is going to get a lot worse, and the government has to get in front of this probably sooner rather than later. And yet, Kazakhstan has fantastic power here. They can freeze the Belt and Road or freeze elements of the Belt and Road until such time as their cousins are all released, either back into Xinjiang or across the border to Kazakhstan. Why isn't the government getting in front of this?
Go ahead.
I think it probably will, because there's a history in Kazakhstan of the population being nervous about Chinese moving into the country, China taking over the economy of the country. You might remember, what was it, at least 10 years ago when China was first trying to get large tracts of agricultural land.
And again 3 years ago.
And again
Yeah,
3
yes,
years
yeah,
ago,
yeah.
but it started
Yep.
quite a while back. And people protested that.
Absolutely.
Not
25-year leasing. It wasn't purchased.
No, it
Still-
was- yep,
No,
yep.
that's right, but still, it was people saying, no, this is not right for us and for our country. And no, there were not protests in the street, but they made their views known to the government, and the government backed off on that. And I think that's in process right now. We'd love to see it solved sooner rather than later, obviously, but I think it's in process, and the government will listen once again. But they'll move very slowly under the table to get it solved.
You've seen the government in Kazakhstan, on the one hand, cracking down on protesters on the subject, on the other hand, then reaching out to them, reflecting the political dynamic that Dick mentioned. So this is something to watch closely. Because you're right, for a certain portion of the Kazakh population, this is a very important issue.
That's right.
Okay, right here.
I am Greg Karp, former diplomat. Greg Karp, former Foreign Service. We realize there's been some transition in Kazakhstan, but really how independent is Mr. Tokayev from Nazarbayev, and what about the positioning of Dariga into the heir apparent role? Does this suggest that the clan's kleptocratic practices are going to continue?
Well, if I may again.
By default.
Craig, you've just touched on a few of the very key issues of this transition as seen from the outside. It is a managed tradition. Yes, indeed, Dariga, President Nazarbayev's daughter, who has long thought would lead the next generation of Nazarbayev and Nazarbayeva leadership in the country. She's now the chairman of the Senate, I
She's in
believe.
Tokayev's former position.
In Tokayev's former position. Should something happen to Tokayev, she becomes the acting president. And there's some people who speculate that he's just an interim president in any case. They allowed his election for appearance purposes, but all the other stuff goes on behind the scenes. And it's not just the corrupt clan, the Nazarbayev clan. Keep in mind that it's the whole oligarchical system there. And not only the oligarchical system, but the oligarchical system that intersects with organized crime, both in Central Asia and from Russia. So once again, it's very, very different system. And Tokayev is riding across the top. He's respected internationally. He's respected within the country. But Papa Nazarbayev still maintains control of the security services and some of the most fundamental decision-making in the country. He's not out there every day as president, but he certainly is a powerful figure at this point, and he has family members who are positioned to step in. Not so that they can reap all the wealth of the country, but that's just how things are done. In some ways, it's a khanate.
Just a quick follow-up. Are there other family members aside from Dariga in position?
There have long been other family members. There have been both the children and their spouses, all of them who are enormously wealthy now. I don't particularly right now know to tell you which position each one is in, but yes, they're out there, of course.
Okay, next question. Right there next to you.
Alex Sanchez, James Defense. Two questions. One, you briefly mentioned the possibility of creating a sort of regional bloc. I remember that back in the 1990s there was a Central Asian Union that Nazarbayev supported with the creation of the establishment of an agreement of eternal friendship between Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, I think in 1997. But it only lasted a few years, and then the project dissolved. What do you think is the future of this potential Central Asian Union 2.0, and what will be Kazakhstan's role in it? could you create some kind of regional Central Asian trade bloc with the AIFC as its center? And the second question will be about Kazatomprom, the crown jewel of Kazakhstan's state-run companies. From what I understand, the government is partially privatizing Kazatomprom. It's been listed in the AIFC and the London Stock Exchange. What do you think is the future of this company? Thank you.
Well, let's start with the easy question about Kazatomprom. A chunk of it was privatized, if I remember correctly, 20 or 25%, something like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where it's
Through the
listed.
AIFC.
Yeah.
Through AIFC in London.
Yep.
It was oversubscribed. It floated at 12. It's about 15. The last time I checked, about 2 weeks ago. I don't know what is.
I haven't checked it.
Yesterday.
Yeah.
I think it was a pilot to see how the privatization goes and how AIFC is functioning. AIFC, as Dan mentioned, is a very ambitious project. It's not just a stock market. It's also a court tribunal that by constitution of Kazakhstan applies British law, English law, and has former Chief Justice Wolf of UK presiding over the court, and the working language is English, and the decisions have to be recognized by Kazakh courts. I worked on legal reform in other countries, Russia, Georgia, and I know how the local judges look at things like that. There probably is going to be resentment, but probably it's going to be overcome. On your very good question about Central Asian Union, at the time in the 90s, think about it, these countries were just like butterflies that came out of cocoon. Everybody wanted to flap its wings and be independent. And of course, Nazarbayev, by almost an instinct, being an integrationist. So the idea of Eurasian European Union was Nazarbayev. It wasn't a Russian idea back in the early 90s. The idea of the Central European Union was Nazarbayev. The Uzbeks did not play nicely in that sandbox.
That's right.
Now things are changed. Now we have 25 years of independence, and hopefully these countries may think, if we reduce barriers to trade, if we reduce visa barriers, if we reduce bureaucratic red tape, we may get a couple of percentage points of GDP growth. The big question is, how does that idea relate to and integrates with the Eurasian Economic Union, the Belt and Road Initiative, etc.? If they manage to cut deals with Moscow and Beijing, there is a chance for that. I very well remember your colleague, Ambassador Steve Sistanovich, pushing for Eurasian integration. We still have that priority with, C5+1? With Secretary Kerry and others trying to have a six-way dialogue with the 5 Central Asian states and the United States. I think that it should be pursued, it should be explored. How would Turkmenistan play in that sandbox? I don't know. They are so obsessively neutral and at the same time isolationist that I'm not sure they will see the advantages. How a corrupt authoritarian regime in Tajikistan is going to play in that, I don't know. But clearly the two main engines, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, if they are on board, if they are pushing, just their critical mass is going to propel it forward.
So to add on to the discussion of the integration, I think, and Kazakhstan's potential role in that, I think it's absolutely in Kazakhstan's interest to push for that. As we've talked about, Kazakhstan is a huge country, low population density. The markets aren't there for some of the levels of investment that they want to attract. So to attract that kind of investment, there has to be access to the markets to sell and export these goods. So Uzbekistan to the south, the rest of Central Asia as one of those potential markets is something that I think they'll continue to push and try to lead towards.
If Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan can maintain and build on the cooperation that's been established over the past 2.5 years, not only both countries to develop and benefit, but the whole region. And that will be important, not just economically, as Sarah points out, but geopolitically.
Absolutely.
Because the two countries working together would offer some problems for either Beijing or Moscow for any imperial ambitions that either has. And of course, we all know about Moscow's imperial ambitions, but China is the rising power, and it's demonstrated a willingness to throw its weight around, at least in the South and the East China Seas. Less so in Central Asia. Less so. Okay, go ahead, jump in.
I think it's important to remember that this is not going to become a Central Asia Union. It's not that the countries are going to give up their sovereignty. What they're doing is exploring ways to work more closely together. And it's going to be pretty loosey-goosey step by step for quite a long while yet. But the fact that Uzbekistan is now ready to play nicely in the sandbox makes it a big deal. There was a little bit of reference to the U.S. C5+1 that you probably saw me smirk at or snort at.
Yes, we noticed. The camera picked it up.
And the reason I say that is that, yes, it's good that we do that. It shines a little bit of a spotlight on the region for a fairly short period every year. But other countries have done it too. Japan has a C5+1. South Korea has a C5+1. And the most important thing that's happening right now is in Central Asia, this is no longer a +1. It's a C5, and they're doing it on their own without outside influence and intervention. It's probably going to follow the ASEAN model that took a full generation to establish, and they went for the least common denominators early on, economics. Not economic integration, but economic cooperation. And that makes a big difference. But I think it's going to go that direction.
Okay. I think ASEAN is the model, and you'll never, ever have the teeth that gives the power to the European Union, the Court of Justice. You're never going to see such instruments.
Oh, no, no.
No, they don't want to give up that level of sovereignty. Absolutely.
No,
yeah.
That's right.
But ASEAN, I think, is the long-term aspiration for these sub-regional groups.
And I would say we should be cautious not to call it a union either. It's going to become some sort of an association, a bloc, an economic union, maybe. Don't use the word union.
Yeah, that has different connotation.
Yeah.
The bottom line is the countries, the region has a tremendous economic potential, including the intra-regional trade. It's what, 70 million people now, right? The population is what? It also has a lot of natural resources. One thing I didn't talk about is the rare earths, the rare metals.
Yeah, Kazakhstan.
China cornered that market. I'm old enough to have written about that in the early 1980s as a young journalist. And at that time, this was still the Cold War. At that time, we, the United States, had a fear that the Soviet Union is going to try to corner it by expanding into Africa, especially in Southern Africa, with, what is it, the National Liberation Movement, Nelson Mandela's.
African National Congress.
African National Union.
Yes.
African National Congress and Zimbabwe and all that. Where's all that? It's gone. China developed it. Central Asia has
Kazakhstan,
a lot of resources, including Kazakhstan. But I want to mention something else. Last year at ITIC, we published a report on the infrastructure development and investment in Central Asia. Please go to iticorg.net, iticnet.org, find that report. And in that report, there's a quote from the Chinese commander of the ground forces who says, pretty much, we need to follow the Belt and Road and project power along the Belt and
Well,
Road.
this is definitely going to happen.
Including in Central Asia.
It's happening.
This year, we're going to publish another report, which is soft infrastructure development in Central Asia. Probably will come out in the fall, and please follow it and have it. There will be some interesting stuff in there as
So
well.
I know you want us to comment on this too.
Just one more brief comment on the privatization and back to the Astana International Financial Center. A very ambitious project, one that I have to be honest, I think the business community was a bit skeptical of to start with. You know, there was already a stock exchange in Almaty. Why do we need to move it? Why do we need to start this over? And I think the bringing in British common law, then there was questions of why not just work to make local Kazakh law better. I do have to say, last year though, the AIFC started working with the local bar association which I think business saw as a huge step, because there was the question of, if something was decided in this bubble for the investors, how would it be applied in the different oblasts? And I think that that is probably still one of the things we're going to be looking at forward. Is there's good things said in Nur-Sultan, there's good things said at the national government level. How they're applied and how they're actually carried out will be actually what's important.
Well, real briefly, and as I said a year ago in Astana, that I look at these as disruptors. And I mean, in the Reagan years, I loved the concept of enterprise zones, but I always said, why just do them for the poor neighborhoods? If it's such good policy, let's do it for the whole country. So I'm hopeful that this is a pilot. Yeah. They see these things working at AIFC, it'll be rolled out for the country. Similarly, the disruptive nature of the Nazarbayev University. Why isn't that a model for the entire higher ed system? So I'm hoping that these can be positives that spread.
Okay, thank you. Question over here, Rick. Rich.
Rich Koslerich, George Mason University. Thanks, John. Excellent panel, great perspective. Pretty one-sided focus, but maybe that's for the future. But maybe quick question and an observation. Why would the oligarchs and people who control the state-owned assets go along with a privatization scheme, even if it's part of the official rhetoric? And the second point is a personal observation. I think your arguments about what's going on politically in Azerbaijan are Kazakhstan.
Understandable.
And in Azerbaijan are not strengthened by these comments about RFERL. I know from Azerbaijan there are people associated with RFERL who've been blackmailed, tortured, and imprisoned. And I think it's not unique to that country. So observe what you will about the opposition and the role it is. I don't think it's helpful to suggest that somehow RFERL is involved in subversive activities in these places.
Question, any responses?
Let me start with the economic issue. The oligarchs, such as they are, understand that they need political stability, and sometimes political stability in some authoritarian regimes is achieved by more, I don't want to say oppression, but more rigidity, and sometimes it is achieved by allowing the society and the country to develop to the next level. And I think Kazakhstan is reaching the step where more stability and more security for one's investment will be achieved through developing the rule of law, developing the political system, and it is, to me, as aspirational as it is observational, but I think that's a vector in Kazakhstan. Azerbaijan is a different country, and it's a different discussion. But if you want your assets to be secure, that's the direction I would go, and I would advise, and I do advise companies and people, I would advise them to go there. Now, in terms of subsidies and protection, Tokayev is on the record, no more bailouts for banks. I think that's significant because banks were bailed out, and we also know that bankers escaped to Europe with billions of dollars, and that is not a desirable situation. I think the economic policy is going to be more hard-nosed going forward. Also, for the reasons I mentioned before, the oil prices are not in triple digits. The oil bonanza, not only it's not happening, with a global slowdown, with American shale being a massive player in the oil market, I think we're not looking at oil, not at 100 and not at 90. Maybe the top stops in great growth or a massive geopolitical disruption in the Persian Gulf, which may happen with Iran, 80s and 90s. And yeah, 80s and 90s would be nice if you are a Kazakhstan or a Saudi Arabia or a Russia. But so far it's not happening. Because the moment it goes up to 60s and 70s, US starts to pump. And this is something Kazakhstan decision makers need to take into account, Russian decision makers, or for that matter, Iranian and Saudi decision makers. The extreme case is Venezuela. This is what happens when you're managing your hydrocarbon revenue in an irresponsible way. Of course, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and Russia do not do stupid things like Venezuela does. But they need to be prudent, they need to be hard-nosed, they need to have a good, strong business sense of what they can do and what they cannot do. And I think that is sinking in very well.
Let's get John over here, too.
Kathy Kosman, thanks so much for this great discussion. But I am a bit surprised that in this discussion there's been so little talk about Western Kazakhstan, which, as the population there is extremely well aware, is the poorest region of the country and produces most of the country's wealth, of course, in the form of oil. Also, I had a question. Is it true that China owns 51% of the Kazakh oil company? And if so, I think that helps shed a lot of, perspective on Kazakh relations with China. Finally, the Oralman, who were the Kazakhs who fled to China during, I believe, the artificial famine in Kazakhstan in the 30s, it was 30s. They mostly were forcibly settled in Western Kazakhstan. So hence my argument about paying more attention to the Caspian, Western Kazakhstan and the Caspian region. Thank you.
You want to take that? Okay.
I think you've raised a lot of good points. A lot of the wealth in Kazakhstan is not properly distributed, obviously, evenly throughout the country. Rich, you talked about the oligarchs. The oligarchs are now second generation. They're cleaning up their former acts and becoming internationally respected businessmen, as happens all over the world, not just in Kazakhstan. The first generation gets their hands and feet dirty. The second one puts on the white shirt and tie and goes to international conferences. So I think that is part of the growth and maturation of a very, very young country.
On Western Kazakhstan, I think that this is one of these challenges. I mean, we're not trying to paint a rosy picture here that everything is hunky-dory, because it ain't. And in Western Kazakhstan, the government would need to commit resources, think through policies, appoint good personnel. I mean, the firing of Akims is legendary in Kazakhstan. So yeah, find good Akims, competent people. And I don't know what the plans are to move to election. I think Nazarbayev was talking about sort of trial areas where Akims would be elected, right?
The mayors.
Yeah, the mayors and the Akims. So I think you remember several years ago there were protests in Western Kazakhstan. I think there was police alleged brutality. I don't know what came out of those investigations. But also there other stuff happening. There was a big explosion of explosive storage in one of the regions, and that's being investigated and whatnot. So yeah, they need to address that. Some of the big oil projects, such as Kashagan, have a high break-even point. It's offshore in very difficult environment. It's several hundred meters deep, but there are a lot of climate and current challenges in that huge oil and oil condensate production project called Kashagan. So they need to watch it like a hawk, but it doesn't mean they cannot solve it.
Right. Time is up. There are 3 people who want to ask questions. I'm going to give them each 30 seconds, and I'm serious. So first, right here, 30 seconds. Okay. Okay, good. Over here and over here. 30 seconds each.
John Gardner, former general counsel at USAID. Just to supplement what Dan said.
20 seconds.
5 extra now. I was in Nursultan and in the rural areas in Akmola. Every precinct I visited, including unscheduled stops, I controlled the driver, had independent election observers, either from opposition candidates or parties, or from youth NGOs.
Okay.
And we saw that.
Thank you.
So.
Okay, over here.
Thank you. Murad Said Ahmedov from Eurasia Foundation.
Speak up.
Question regarding Russian influence in the energy sector. Do you think Russian proposals to Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan to build nuclear power plants, is it like attempt to save or preserve the influence in future, like longer term, because they do know that China will overtake the Russian influence in Central Asia, and how in future, if Uzbekistan actually they want to start nuclear power plant in 2022 in Kazakh region,
we got it.
How it influencing Uzbek-Kazakh relations?
Russia is understandably capitalizing on its comparative advantage. And the Rosatom has a comparative advantage in the world where China is not yet producing competitive reactors, and the U.S. is no longer producing competitive reactors, and the only ones who really compete with Russia is France and South Korea. So who are they going to choose? Kazakhstan probably will choose Rosatom. Uzbekistan, I really don't know. I didn't look into that. And then the other question is the nuclear the right selection of type of energy? Because yes, you need a baseline, base load. You need something that rain or shine is producing your base load. And yes, nuclear is zero emission base load. At the same time, gas is 50% less than coal. Kazakhstan has tons of coal. Are they going to produce as much emissions as coal does? I don't know. We did a study of future Kazakhstan energy needs back in 2012, I want to say. Things changed since 2012. The cost of solar, 80% down from 2011, I think. 80% down of solar, but it's intermittent. So very interesting, very important questions. I guess Rosatom out of these two will get at least 50%, at least Kazakhstan, maybe also Uzbekistan, but at the same time, we're looking at the next generation of smaller modular reactors. Very interesting. I've written even about fusion. That's probably 2050 and up, but it's coming. Thank you.
Okay. I'd like to thank our panelists for a very interesting discussion. Thank you all for coming.
We're done. Okay, let's get a photo of our